Shemai. This video will attempt to briefly cover a history of the Welsh language, highlighting and giving context to important events in the development of the language, the culture surrounding it, and the politics that affects and is affected by the Welsh language in the present day. The most important events in the history of the language will have their own videos later in this series, where we'll explore their impact and how these events should be viewed by materialists, but they will be mentioned in this video, albeit more briefly in the wider scope of the history of Welsh. I should also stress before I go any further that my background is in history and politics, not in linguistics. I have an understanding of linguistics afforded to me by studying the history and politics of languages, but I'm not a linguist and I'm always learning. So if there's any concepts that those of you who are more well versed in linguistics as a science feel that I brush over or misunderstand, please tell me where my understanding is flawed and I'll learn from you. My knowledge is in the field of political history and governance mainly, so that is what I'll primarily be covering in relation to language. But the breadth of this topic means that I'll have the opportunity to cover a wide range of angles, and judging by the comments on my first video, there's an appetite for a wide range of content on this channel. Basically, I have a good understanding of what I'm going to be covering, but I don't know everything, and I hope to learn from you just as I hope to teach you what I know. With all the disclaimers out of the way, we can get on with the history. Welsh is a language within the Celtic language family, which itself is a family of Indo-European languages that formerly dominated a large amount of mainland Europe, stretching from Anatolia in the east to Britannia and Hibernia in the west. Modern historical consensus, formed around the research of Celtic historian John T. Koch, suggests that Celtic culture first arrived in the Isles in the Bronze Age, not through conquest, but through an extensive Western European trading network that enabled the migration of people from mainland Europe. The language that these Celtic people spoke is often a matter of contention among linguists. The primary point of divergence among scholars is whether the developmental point of divergence for insular Celtic languages, that is the languages that would come to be present in modern-day Britain and Ireland, began to occur before or after the Celtic migration to the islands of Britannia and Hibernia. Scholars such as Warren Cowgill and Peter Shriver argue that the divergence must have occurred when the Celtic languages were present in Britannia and Hibernia, citing developmental features in insular Celtic languages that are very similar to each other, such as the way absolute and conjunct verb endings are formed that are absent in records we have of continental Celtic languages, like the inscriptions found written in Celt-Iberian. However, John T. Koch, among other linguistic historians, presents the case for the divergence forming prior to the migration to Britannia and Hibernia, suggesting the Goidelic branch, Irish, Scottish Gaelic and Manx, and the Brythonic branch, Welsh, Cornish and Breton, had already begun to form and diverge prior to the beginning of the migration, suggesting the Goidelic languages may have origins in Celt-Iberian Celtic, while the Brythonic languages may have their origins in Gallo-Brittonic Celtic. Whatever the case may be, the Celtic language spoken on the island of Britannia would diverge from the languages spoken in mainland Europe and those on the island of Hibernia, forming a Celtic language referred to as Common Brittonic. Common Brittonic would continue to be the dominant language on the island of Britannia from the 6th century BC until sometime between the 5th and 8th centuries AD, when it was surpassed by its descendants and external factors began to push Celtic languages to the fringes of Britain. Before we discuss the factors which significantly affected the popularity of Common Brittonic, though, we do have to discuss a prominent historical event that surprisingly had very little effect on the language. In 43 AD, the Roman Empire began their invasion of Britain. It would take 4 decades before the Romans were able to fully conquer the region south of Hadrian's Wall, and even after that point, Roman Britain was no stranger to revolts and risings against Roman rule. However, despite the conquering of the vast majority of the territory in which Common Brittonic is spoken, and more than 3 centuries of Roman rule, Common Brittonic continued to be the most popular language on the island of Britannia. In fact, the language continued to be the most popular spoken language on this island for another century and a half. Even then, its decline was in part due to being superseded by its own descendant languages of Welsh, Cornish and Cumbric, and in France, for reasons that will be covered later, Breton. This remarkable lack of impact on the language that Roman occupation had, for 3 centuries even, suggests that there is something qualitatively different in the Roman form of imperial governance from more modern forms of colonialism. This isn't an area I'm especially well versed in, so if there are any classicists or Roman historians watching, I would love to hear your thoughts, and if you have any reading recommendations on why the Roman occupation of Britain had so little effect on the popularity of Common Brittonic in comparison to later imperial ventures in the early modern and modern periods, which had such devastating impacts on indigenous languages. If you know anything more on this topic, I'd love to hear from you. That isn't to say, however, that the Roman occupation of Britain didn't have an effect on Common Brittonic, and the languages that succeeded it. It has been estimated there are more than 800 loan words in Common Brittonic that come from Latin, and many of these are still present in living Brythonic Celtic languages such as Welsh, Cornish and Breton. One example in Welsh is the word for window, fenester, which comes from the Latin fenestra. We can still see the imprint of Latin on modern Celtic languages as they're spoken today. Now we come to one of the most important periods in the history of Celtic language on the island of Britannia, the period commonly referred to as the Anglo-Saxon Settlement. This was a process which largely occurred in the 5th and 6th centuries, whereby Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, originating from the modern-day Netherlands, Germany and Denmark, began to settle inland on the east and south coasts of modern-day England. Estimates vary from as few as 20,000 individuals migrating to Britannia to up to potentially 250,000, bringing with them the languages and cultures that would come to form into Anglo-Saxon. This process was instrumental in the displacement of Common Brittonic-speaking peoples and the marginalisation of Celtic languages on a British scale. While there is still an active academic discussion over whether violent force or cultural pressure was the most important factor in the establishment of Anglo-Saxon cultural supremacy over modern-day England, the Celtic people of England were undoubtedly faced with some degree of both as Germanic migrants swept westward and established settlements. The Celtic people living in Anglo-Saxon territory, or land that would soon be annexed by Anglo-Saxons, were faced with a choice of assimilating into Anglo-Saxon culture or fleeing to the fringes of the island and beyond. While there is a good amount of genetic evidence to suggest that many Celtic people did choose to live within Anglo-Saxon society, many also decided to flee to areas away from Anglo-Saxon rule and cultural hegemony. The numbers that did choose to flee are unknown, but were significant enough to be recorded as the second great migration into Armorica, the region that would come to constitute the modern Breton nation, by contemporary monk and historian Gildas. The migration into the remotest areas of Britannia, and even as far away as modern-day Brittany, further accelerated the fracturing of Common Brittonic, which had already begun developing regional variations prior to Anglo-Saxon migration. By the turn of the 8th century, these regional variations had fully diverged into separate languages of Welsh, Cornish, Breton and Cumbric. In the course of 3 centuries, the language and culture that was dominant across the entirety of the island of Britannia had become peripheralised and marginalised into a scattered group of peninsulas and mountainous regions. While this period would represent a massive shift in the demographics of the island of Britannia, it would also represent what was effectively the birth of the Welsh language. Historian Janet Davis argues that while the Welsh language itself could be said to be in its embryonic stage as early as the year 600 AD, the cultural isolation caused by the Anglo-Saxon migration and the retreat of Common Brittonic speakers into Wales, among other areas, was a petri dish required to foster the birth of the Welsh language as a distinct cultural development, rather than a regional variation of Common Brittonic. This could be considered the first example of how the Welsh people are defined by the English in a way, as without the Anglo-Saxon migration there would likely be no Welsh language distinct from Celtic British language. This theme of being defined by and in contrast to the English will permeate through the rest of Welsh history, but that is now a concern today, as we are only interested in the language and the politics around it, rather than broader Welsh history. For much of the period of the early Middle Ages, the history of the language is relatively uneventful. With Wales being split between a variety of shifting Welsh-speaking kingdoms, the language formed the fabric of daily life. The only area in which Welsh wasn't the most common language used was amongst the clergy, who used Latin as was the norm across most of Europe in this period. 1066 brought the Norman conquest and unification of England. The newly unified Norman England began to launch skirmishes into Wales, which, while important from a historical and political perspective, had very little effect on the language as a whole. Even when all of Wales was conquered and the Statute of Rhuddlan was signed in 1284, and further made into a province of England in 1301, there was very little tangible change for Welsh speakers, who still enjoyed the right to speak their own language and the continuation of Welsh customs, albeit under now English rule. The first piece of specifically anti-Welsh language legislation would be passed under the rule of Henry VIII, who, with the Laws in Wales Act 1535 to 1542, sought to abolish any legal distinction between Welsh and English people and provinces. While this prevented any unique legislation against Welsh people, as had been brought in as a punishment after the Glyndŵr Rebellion against English rule, it also sought to abolish the Welsh legal system altogether. This made English the only language of official procedure, meaning that English would be the language of courts and government, whether or not those attending were able to speak English or not. It also meant that Welsh monoglot speakers were effectively excluded from holding any form of public office. This legislation effectively closed off the secular public sphere to the Welsh language, meaning that for all intents and purposes, the government only recognised there being one language in England and Wales outside of the Church, which wouldn't be immune to linguistic centralisation for very long either. The act that attacked the role of the Welsh language in the religious sphere was the Act of Uniformity 1549, passed under Edward VI, which required all acts of public worship to be conducted in English. Since the adoption of Anglican Protestantism in England and Wales by Henry VIII, services had been conducted in the language of the communities they served, which meant that for the first time in history, Welsh speakers could hear their own language spoken at the pulpit. This act meant that the only language any religious service could be delivered in would be English. While this may not be a majorly damaging piece of legislation today, when this act was passed, the church was the centre of learning in the community. In Welsh life in this period, the church had unparalleled importance in the public sphere. It was the place where the community came together and engaged with literature from outside their own communities. For the vast majority of parishioners, the Bible was the only book they had ever seen. For this area of public life to be made monolingually English was devastating for Welsh speakers who held the church in very high regard. On a practical level, to have the text of the Bible spoken to them in a language they understood was invaluable to education in feudal farming communities, and the imposition of English on a church that had only recently begun speaking to parishioners in a language they understood closed off the religious sphere to any public engagement with the Welsh language. On a more psychological level, the impact of being shown that your language was not worthy of being spoken in a church would have had a real impact on pious Welsh-speaking communities. Ironically, the intention of this legislation was to encourage the spread of Protestantism and centralise authority in the Anglican Church. The language clauses were primarily intended to persecute Catholics who gave sermons in Latin. However, in 1563, under the rule of Elizabeth I, legislation was passed ensuring that alongside the English language translation of the Bible, in Wales, there must also be a Welsh translation of both the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. This was a seismic shift in the direction of policy, seemingly recognising the Welsh language as an important language of religion, if not one fit for government and statecraft. This act was, in reality, another attempt at religious centralisation, maintaining the Anglican Church's power while giving the Welsh-speaking parishioners a way to engage with that power. The 1549 Act of Uniformity had seen a great deal of resistance, especially in Cornwall, where Cornish speakers rose in rebellion against the Act in order to still receive sermons in the Cornish language. Elizabeth I's government knew that Wales was a prime location for enemy invasion, as it had been how her grandfather had secured the throne in the War of the Roses, and didn't want a discontented Welsh-speaking populace aiding a continental Catholic nation in their invasion attempt. The act mandating an Anglican church have the Bible and Book of Common Prayer in Welsh was a calculated political manoeuvre, but nonetheless it had a huge impact. At a time when Welsh was banned from public life, both religious and secular, the admission of Welsh language text into the religious sphere created an opportunity for Welsh people to become literate in their own language and see its value. In languages that were affected by very similar legislation, such as Cornish, we can see the real cost of the language being given no room to exist in a public sphere. While Welsh did decline in the 19th and 20th centuries, it is still a living language that has never been threatened to the point of extinction. Cornish, on the other hand, is critically endangered, and its continued use is thanks to the hard work of individual private campaigners. Anastasia Llewellyn identifies the translation of the Bible into Welsh as providing a critical venue for the use of the Welsh language by its speakers, suggesting this translation is what ensured the language would continue to play a role in daily life in Wales. This allowance of a public presence for the Welsh language only in the religious sphere meant that Welsh would remain the language of religion in Wales, and the cause of the language would most often be tied to Christianity. This is a theme that would recur from this moment on, with the regions of Wales with the most Welsh speakers also being the regions that take the hardest line on religion. Whilst this association is waning somewhat in the modern day, the association between the Welsh language and Christianity, more specifically chapel-going Christianity, remains a relatively prominent feature in Welsh political life, even if it's not as strong as it once was. Examples of this association will occur later in the chronology. Nevertheless, as the feudal period of development was coming to a close in the 15th and 16th centuries, Welsh remained the primary language spoken in Wales, and a daily lived language for the vast majority of people, with exception of a few communities close to the border and the southern region of Pembrokeshire, where English had been the primary language due to Anglo-Norman settlement during the medieval period. This wasn't to last, however, with the growth of industrialisation and urbanisation in the centuries to come. It is difficult to overstate the importance of coal in Welsh history, and especially the history of the Welsh language. Coal in Wales, particularly in the South Wales valleys, has always been abundant, and there's evidence to suggest that coal was being used and burned to warm homes since the time of the Roman occupation. But with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, the importance of coal skyrocketed. The demand for smelted steels increased as machinery became the backbone of industrial workplaces like cotton mills, and durable metals were needed for cladding modern ships. Electricity brought new innovations in the workplace. Electrical lighting allowed longer working hours and more efficient machine-engineered products, all of which required power. Britain's overseas empire and trading network had become the most expansive in the world, and with this came the need for innovative, faster ocean-going vessels, which themselves also required a source of power. South Wales, and some regions in North Wales, were able to provide a material for all these purposes: coal. The coal mining industry in Wales had been growing since the 15th and 16th centuries, with an export trade developing out of the ports on the south coast, like Swansea. But the mid-18th century was when the demand for coal began to rise exponentially, causing landowners across South Wales to commission surveys of their lands to see if they had coal seams worth exploiting. By the 19th century, Cardiff, Swansea and Newport were linked by rail and canal to the upper valleys, with 4.5 million tonnes of coal being produced in 1840 alone. 750,000 tonnes of this was intended for export. This massive growth of industry meant that towns across the South Wales coalfield came into existence in a very short period of time, including my own town of Ebervale. Ebervale had been a small hamlet of roughly 120 people across the whole valley prior to the Industrial Revolution. An ironworks was built in 1778, and along with it came the mines to provide it with coal. By the 1930s, the population had ballooned to over 30,000 people, most of whom worked in the now steelworks or industries that served it. By 1945, the steelworks would become the largest in Europe. Now, why is this information relevant to the history of the language? Because industry requires labour, and that labour won't necessarily be from Welsh-speaking backgrounds. In fact, the immigration into Wales during this period of time came from every corner of the world for the job opportunities that presented themselves here. The earliest immigration was from rural areas of Wales, for better job opportunities offered in growing urbanised valleys, but the waves of immigration would come from England as well, often moving from northern English towns to South Wales, that, by virtue of the more recent urban development, often had better amenities than the older industrial towns of the north of England that had developed around fabric mills. There were also notable waves of immigration from Ireland, Italy, and the Indian subcontinent, among many, many others. Although this story comes from the even more multicultural Bute Town area of Cardiff, it serves to illustrate the point of how diverse South Wales was becoming. The historian Glenn Jordan talks about how the Yemeni Muslims of Bute Town would often hold a march around Cardiff on the day of Muhammad's birth, and he talked to a local imam about this, asking if this was a specifically Yemeni tradition. Apparently it wasn't. Instead, the local Islamic community had seen the Irish Catholics at Corpus Christi marching in the city, and they adopted the tradition for themselves. The political scientist Alfred Zimmern coined the term American Wales to characterise the multicultural nature of South Wales that had, much like America, seen such great immigration that it had become culturally distinct as an area from the rest of Wales. Over time, this immigration meant that the lingua franca between the disparate groups in this area was not Welsh, but English, and the number of Welsh speakers began to fall. By 1911, less than half of the Welsh people could speak Welsh fluently, and these speakers were mostly found within northwest Wales. In many ways, Welsh had become a victim of what Robert Phillipson coins linguistic imperialism, although not necessarily directly. Britain overseas had attempted to quell indigenous languages and impose English on their colonial subjects, partly in order to ensure British hegemony should decolonisation ever occur. This meant that for the diverse people coming to Wales from British colonial possessions in Ireland, the West Indies, the Indian subcontinent, China, etc., the easiest language to communicate in was English. Coupled with the English immigration, this meant that Welsh would become a peripheral, marginalised language in South Wales, a language for the home, and perhaps the church, but not for the workplace or the wider community. Immigration, and British colonial policy, was not the only factor in the decline of the language, but it was the major one. Some other factors that could be said to have contributed to the decline of the Welsh language could include the Blue Books. These were a set of reports commissioned by the British government on the state of education in Wales that concluded the reason that Welsh children weren't achieving their educational potential was the inherently backwards nature of Welsh language and the culture that came with it. These reports were undertaken in part by interviewing monolingual Anglican priests, who often had a very Anglo-centric view of their work in Wales. The response to these reports in Wales was outrage, and this in part contributed to the divide between English and Welsh-speaking Wales's religion, where many Welsh people decided to turn to nonconformist chapels in the Baptist and Methodist traditions in order to be part of a Christian community which prioritised the Welsh language, while English-speaking Welsh people remained with the Anglican Church. Another effect of the Blue Books was to create a culture within Welsh-speaking Wales of a defensive bastion of the Welsh language against outside interference. This culture clustered around the Liberal Party, who was seen as the party representing Wales in the 19th century, and around chapels and nonconformist religious practices. This community, largely clustered in North and West Wales, constitutes Zimmern's Welsh Wales, often referred to as Yfro Gymraeg. Another factor, influenced by the Blue Books, which undoubtedly pushed some people away from the Welsh language, was the Welsh Knot. This was a punishment for children heard speaking Welsh in some schools, where if a child was heard speaking Welsh, they had to wear a marker for the rest of the day. Often, the child with this marker at the end of the day had some sort of punishment, such as writing lines or caning. Its influence, and how common it was, has often been overstated, but this practice was carried out, and will likely be one of the topics from this video that I dedicate a full video to in future. Whatever causes you attribute it to, by the 1910s, Welsh had become a minority language in its own country. The political responses to the decline of the Welsh language began well before it became a minority language. In 1865, the Welsh nonconformist preacher Michael D. Jones and a group of 153 Welsh-speaking settlers chartered a ship to establish a colony in the Patagonia region of Argentina. The intention of this colony was to better preserve the Welsh language, which they observed as under threat in Wales, and in need of a land in which Welsh people would not have to assimilate into a wider culture, as Jones had witnessed occurring in Welsh immigrants to the United States. The community of Welsh speakers in Patagonia still exists today, and is home to anywhere between 1,500 and 5,000 Welsh speakers. Obviously, the irony of establishing a settler colony on indigenous Tuolchi people's land was lost on the settlers, who seemed to concern themselves primarily with the preservation of their own language, and didn't very much consider the indigenous languages of the land they were occupying. While admittedly, the relationship between the settlers and the indigenous people of the region was largely cordial, at least compared with other notable relationships between settler and indigenous populations, that doesn't detract from the fact that this project was settler colonial, and this settlement, while certainly not the only factor, or even a major one, contributed to the decline of the Chonan languages, which were tragically made extinct, with the last native speakers dying in 2019. As an aside, I should note that the extinction of a language, especially in the modern day, isn't as bleak as it sounds. This isn't to minimise the massive loss that having the last native speakers of the chosen languages die is, but don't let that discourage you. The longer a language lives, the more documentation, research, and resources there are on it. There is likely a great deal of documentation in the chosen languages. There are probably academic texts compiling the features of its lexicon and grammatical structure. It is possible to revive these languages that have gone extinct, and it has happened before. All these languages need are dedicated individuals who are willing to dedicate their time to them. It takes a lot of work and often requires engaging in politics in order to provide beneficial policy decisions to nurturing these linguistic revivals, but it can and has happened. There are ways for you to help, both in a professional career and as a volunteer. If there's interest, I can make a video in future detailing how languages have been revived and what you can do to help in this process. Returning to Wales, the political responses to the decline of the language didn't solely consist of settler colonialism. In 1886, for example, the organisation Cymru Fydd was founded, which campaigned to get Home Rule for Wales, in this case meaning some degree of self-government, similar to what Wales has under the current devolved settlement. The founders of this movement were largely followers of Gladstonian liberalism, and were in large part members of the Liberal Party. They claimed to be influenced by the Irish Home Rule movement, but unlike the Irish movement, never called for a political structure within Wales divorced from the British system. Rather, their interest was in creating a Welsh political structure that could manage some degree of Welsh affairs, but be subservient to the British Parliament in London. The movement was very liberal and middle class, largely formed of Whiggish businessmen from Wales, who had come to live in London and other major English cities for business opportunities. Due to this, the movement was a minority of a minority, in that it was largely represented by and representative of a handful of wealthy Welsh businessmen. This movement functionally collapsed in 1896 due to opposition within the Welsh liberal movement to Cymru Fydd. While nothing much came of this movement, David Lloyd George was its leader for a short period of time, and after the collapse of the movement turned his attention to more Britain-wide politics, and will later become the only Welsh-speaking Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Though a Welshman and a Welsh speaker, Lloyd George didn't do a great deal to improve the situation for the language, and was notably unsympathetic to the Irish cause, condemning the increasingly militant movement against British rule in Ireland in his tenure, and rather pompously remarking to Eamon de Valera in 1921 that neither Welsh nor Irish had a word for republic, possibly to suggest that the idea of republicanism had been graciously given to the colonial subjects by the benevolent British imperialists. As the 20th century rolled on, however, the interest in the politics of the Welsh language was superseded by class politics, which had arguably been the dominant factor in Welsh political life since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Welsh language affairs were increasingly marginal political topics, isolated to Afro Gymraeg areas of Wales. Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, was formed in 1925, but got very little traction in the first 40 years of its existence, with Welsh politics being dominated by the Labour movement, centred in South Wales, and now the declining Liberals who could only count on Welsh-speaking votes. The incident that would change this and bring the language back to the forefront of Welsh politics would be the flooding of Capel Celyn. Capel Celyn was a Welsh-speaking community in North Wales, which was flooded in 1965 to create a reservoir which would provide the city of Liverpool in England with water. Despite protests from residents, and all bar one Welsh MP voting against the proposal, the flooding occurred anyway. This incident invigorated a new Welsh nationalist movement centred on language preservation and a call for independence for Wales. In its aftermath, Plaid Cymru won its first seat in Parliament in 1966 and went on to be the dominant force in Afro Gymraeg, usurping the Liberals. Cymdeithas yr Iaith Cymraeg, the Welsh Language Society, founded only a few years prior, saw its membership surge and started taking direct action in order to preserve the Welsh language, most notably tearing down English language road signs in order to have them replaced with Welsh ones. Perhaps most famously, organisations like the Free Wales Army and Mudiad am Ddiffyn Cymru began a bombing campaign against key pieces of infrastructure, with the MAC attempting to bomb the railway that would allow Prince Charles to arrive in Caernarfon for his inauguration, accidentally killing 2 of their own members in the process. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Meibion Glyndŵr embarked on a campaign of burning down holiday homes in Welsh-speaking North Wales villages, as an attempt to discourage the gentrification and forcing out of Welsh speakers from their own villages. The government in Westminster began changing the position on the language towards the end of the century, In 1982, S4C was created as a publicly funded free-to-air Welsh language television station. In 1993, the Welsh Language Act was passed. The Act stated that Welsh was to be given equal status in the public sector to that of English. This was reiterated by the first devolved government in Cardiff Bay when devolution was brought to Wales in 1998 after a close national referendum. In many ways, that political energy that was reinvigorated by the flooding of Capel Celyn has never really gone away. Plaid Cymru still dominates politics in West and North Wales. Cymdeithas yr Iaith is still an active organisation that run a myriad of campaigns to improve Welsh language representation, and support for the language is very high. Oddly, most high in areas of the South Wales valleys with some of the fewest Welsh language speakers. Since the turn of the century, there has been significant growth in Welsh speakers and learners, with latest polls suggesting around 30% of the country can speak some level of Welsh. Welsh is a compulsory subject in schools, and the Welsh Government has stated that they hope to achieve 1 million speakers by 2050. Along with these efforts, almost all Welsh Government representatives are bilingual and deliver speeches in both English and Welsh. This isn't a perfect situation for the language, however, and I will be making a video on that topic later in this series, detailing the hurdles faced by the growing Welsh language and how they can be overcome from a policy perspective. If you are interested in learning Welsh, there are a growing number of resources for you to use to do so. Welsh is a course on Duolingo, and it is very good, especially when coupled with textbook study. The Routledge Book of Colloquial Welsh by Gareth King is an excellent and thorough guide to learning, which also provides learners with the option of which dialect they learn, which is something I haven't found offered by many other guides. If you're in the UK and looking for Welsh language content, you can watch S4C on television or online through the BBC iPlayer and the S4C website. You can also listen to BBC Radio Cymru online through BBC Sounds. There are also a glut of Welsh language books, bands, YouTube channels which give you the opportunity to practice. Also, just as I'm recording this, I've realised that there's a Welsh educational thing on BBC Bitesize. If you want to really start with the kinds of things that we learn in school, then BBC Bitesize is great for Welsh medium education then. So, I hope you've enjoyed what was intended to be a relatively brief history of the Welsh language. I've certainly missed a lot of detail, and there's a lot more to discuss, which is why I'll be producing more content of this series, going into depth about specific periods in Welsh language history, policy relating to the language, and trying to answer any questions that you may have related to the language. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them to me in the comments, or send them to me on Twitter @CarpenterUnion. I also have a Patreon now, in case any of you want to pay me for something that you can access for free. I'm also really grateful to those of you who have subscribed and the comments which have given me a lot of ideas for future videos. If there's anything you'd like me to cover in specific based on stuff I've discussed here, or just something that you've thought of while listening to this, please do get in touch and I'll be making videos on everything and anything that you're interested in. Until then though, hwyl fawr and dabochi.